Greetings. My name is Dr. Zebulon Maletsky. I'm the Chair of Marketing and PR for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the Executive Producer of Asala TV. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our series in Retrospect and Prospect, Topics in African American Life and History, produced, edited, and hosted by our very own Dr. Lopez Matthews, Chair of the Publications Committee for Asala. Dr. Lopez writes, in remembering Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune wrote the article, The Negro in Retrospect and Prospect. In this piece, she examined the past, foretold the future, and issued a challenge to the post-war informed and educated Black American citizenry. In this spirit, we speak to interesting figures in the Black community to discuss the past, the present, and what we imagine the future will hold. We hope you'll continue to join us and enjoy this series. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lopez Matthews, and I'm the chair of the Publications Committee for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I'm here with C.R. Gibbs, author, lecturer, and historian of the African diaspora, to discuss the participation of African Americans in the military throughout history. And so I'm going to get straight into it. And so I'm going to ask my first question. Why has military service been seen as important for Africans and African Americans?
In the history of this country, the participation of African Americans in the military has been a way up and out. When other lines of endeavor were closed to us, we could make an impact in the military by showing our courage, commitment, and sacrifice. We laid an even firmer claim on our rights and ultimately our citizenship and the right to vote.
You know, that's something very important. I actually wrote a book about African Americans in the military at Howard, and that was a recurring theme in looking at Howard's participation in the military, and that the students really pushed it because they saw it as an opportunity for African Americans to show their patriotism and progress. And so because I read some of the letters and they were just always so gung-ho about Black participation in the military. And so, you know, it was kind of like a living, stark example of the importance of it. And so I wonder, how has this worked out for African Americans? Has it been successful, or has it been futile? What would you think?
You know, it's been a hard road, and there have been times when we needed to go back over and recover ground that we thought we had won. Time and time again, there have been race riots in the military. There have been what I would call drumhead courts, and I say that if we look at Brownsville, for example, in 1906, we did not get the justice. We got something that appeared perhaps at a distance in vapor form to be military justice, but what we got was pretty much what we got in the civilian sector, which was military injustice, or injustice in the military and out of it. So, and when we look at, say, for example, the Militia Act of 1792, and the fact that they really did not want us at the beginning. They did not want Blacks to participate, and codified it in law. And yet we were able, sometimes by stealth, sometimes by people not paying attention to keeping the gate closed, we were able to participate even in the US military in limited numbers during the War of 1812. And we have some evidence that in the conflict since then, in the wars, in uniform and out of uniform, you can find the footprint of African-American sailors, for example, even in the Mexican War. So these are things that while many people consider it an honorable way, I am also reminded of the words in one letter by an African-American Civil War soldier. It was a way to prove manhood, not just simply fitness for citizenship, but to demonstrate that we were not a race of cowards, that we could fight and be brave as well as anyone. So even today, when I was in a debate some years ago about the military draft and how it takes advantage of the lack of opportunities in the civilian sector. And yet there's still opportunities in the military that Black men and women can and should take advantage of.
You know, I'm glad that you brought up that idea that Black men were cowardly. That's something that has always kind of struck me as odd, because I teach about the War College study that said that African Americans, men, were too cowardly to serve in the military. But then here you have Blacks serving in the Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War by then. And I'm like, how do they continue to say that Black men are cowardly and aren't strong and can't fight and aren't intelligent enough? It just always strikes me as something weird. And while employed at the National Archives, I ran across a file titled Negroes, and it talks about Black soldiers being executed for rape, even though the military knew that they were innocent. And they did it for fear of angering white soldiers. Mm-hmm. They thought that they would see it as preferential treatment to Black soldiers to somehow find them innocent of raping a white woman. It would anger soldiers, white soldiers from the South. And so why do you think Black men continued? This was during World War II, by the way. I didn't say when it was, but it was during World War II. And why do you think Black men continued to fight, even though, you know, they face this discrimination and this unfair treatment, even in the military, when they're putting their lives on the line for their country?
It was a battle that we could not afford to quit. That the moment that we stopped, the moment that we refused, and there were instances, for example, in World War II, where, for good reason, there was a reduction, perhaps, in joining the military, or certainly an open discussion. But we suffer when we fight, and we suffer if we don't fight. As late as the Iraq War, I've seen material calling Blacks less patriotic. So we just can't, we're darned if we do and darned if we don't. And I think that since the military has been a relatively reliable area of endeavor, we will continue, with all of its limitations, to enlist in the military, Black men and women.
You know, that's and that's something very important that you brought up, that the fight continues and that we can't give up, and that we have to continually push to gain our rights, because that was one of the arguments I saw for Blacks fighting in the Civil War. I read these articles in the New York Anglo-African where they're saying that Black soldiers shouldn't, you know, leave their bodies to rot under the southern sun when they were killed, fighting for a flag that doesn't support them. But then you had others who said, no, we need to fight and we need to show our strength and show our support for the nation so that we can show that we're good citizens and get our rights. And you're right that continues to be, you know, the story of our time, that we have to continually fight. And that's what I think we see today with the protests happening even last week and the week before. You know, people saying that, you know, the fight hasn't ended. And so that's why we're out in the streets today. So I think that's a very important part that you bring up. Now, I know that you're also an archivist and you help preserve history. And so in talking about this, why do you think preserving our history, and particularly our public history, is important? And I ask that because as you see these monuments to Confederate soldiers coming down, I see another thread about getting rid of plantations and that plantation should be destroyed as well because they're relics of the past. And so what do you think about that? Destroying these sort of public places and monuments that represent the negative aspects of our history.
I think that I'm reminded of the removal of the auction block in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I had met an elder some years ago who told me that as a child, white tourists would pay her to stand on the auction block and give her a few pennies while they took pictures.
Wow.
I have mixed feelings about the removal of the auction block, but I feel better because it's going to a museum. And I think that I would not attach a stick of dynamite or drench many of these statues in nitroglycerin. I would like them to be, for the Confederate symbols, I'd like them to be retired to places of contemplation and historical examination. As far as our history goes, given that it is so lost, so misunderstood, I've met some young men recently who say they don't read. And as I'm sure you would be, I would be at a loss, man, to reach out to these brothers and say, man, listen, you need to read. You need to read. And it's more than if you want to keep a secret from a Black person, put it in a book. It is the fact that the quest for knowledge, much like the quest for citizenship, is an ongoing process that must be lifelong. Just as we see military service as the strongest claim on citizenship and the demonstration that we are fit for anything this country can throw at us, the quest for education, I think Mandela said it was the surest way to make a change in a society. So when I look at the saving of artifacts, to be rather honest with you, we need to present proof all the time. I don't know of a time when Black history has not been challenged, and we need to present proof. If institutions don't do it, then I encourage private citizens to do it. I mean, I donated 130 some pieces to Moreland Spingarn of the C.R. Gibbs Performing Arts collection. We need to do that because there's still people who want to demean us. And as a Civil War expert, you'll recall Woodward's book, Meet General Grant, in the 20s, and supposedly Blacks were the only people in the history of the country to sit by and never actively engage for their own freedom. That was a lie when he wrote it in the 20s, and yet we have people charting, toting that stuff out even today. So it is critical for us to have a material history that we can present not only to the doubters, but also to our children. We owe it so that the history that we have is not always given in the sterile pages of a history book, but that we also can present items of our family. I use the example of a high school yearbook photo as a way to view history. And most of us, first time we get that high school yearbook photo, we look for ourselves. We center ourselves in that photographic experience. It's natural, it's human nature. This is what we must do in history. Then the next thing we do in that high school yearbook photograph is we look for our friends. And I think that's what then we can study the world once we center ourselves in our historical experience. And we must do that in terms of a material endeavor as well as an academic endeavor.
I think that is very important, and that's an important thing to note. As the digital production librarian at Moreland Spingarn, thank you for that donation. But one of the things that I'm doing is digitizing records in the collection to make them available to people around the world. And so in doing that, I see that, there's interest in African-American history in Russia and Japan and England, all throughout Africa. And we see how this history is so important to people all around the world. And now there are places like Moreland that has a digital collection. We can go and learn about Black history outside of the classroom. Most people tend to forget what they've learned in high school history. And sometimes, hopefully, they remember what they've learned in college history. And so it is important to have places like Moreland, like Fisk, like Spelman that have archives as well, that preserve our history and are places that you can go and see and learn. And so I think what you said is very important, especially in preserving our family history, because African American families are very rich in history, and a lot of it isn't written, and a lot of it isn't held in archives. And so it'd be very helpful for us to even preserve our family history. And so I know it isn't on our list, but how do you think someone could go about even preserving their family history? What's like one thing that you would recommend that they do to help?
If people have questions about preserving their family history, it was my honor to speak in the Family History Center at NMOC, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you wonder, what to do with crazy Uncle Ralph's photos, then there's a place that you can call that will help you do it. Of course, the web contains any number of resources, and from how to properly map your historical photographs to keeping a digital record of everything you have. And I advised the family just a few months ago that, particularly since some of their items were in such delicate condition, I said, well, okay, if you can't do anything else, then copy it down digitally, photograph the pieces, so that whatever might happen to the original, you still have a copy of what it is that was a central part of your family's history. And also, it's important for young people to see adults do this. We have to model the behavior we want our young people, the next generation, to have. When they see how important history is to us, it becomes important to them.
That is such a great statement, especially talking about the young people learning about preserving history and knowing who they are and where they come from, because I think that is really what encourages people to do better and develop themselves, because they don't take in the stereotypes that society kind of places on Black people. When they know their history, to know better is to do better. And so I think that that is so important for us to preserve our history and just even our family history, just so we know where we specifically come from, just to help us develop as a society. And so one of the things that I also want to ask is, given our current national crisis with COVID-19, and we have protests related to police brutality and justice, what do you think, what would you encourage everyone to remember about African American history as we're in this moment and in this time?
I would remind people, as we reflect on this, that we've been in tough times before, and that we cannot let the pandemic distract us from our battle for justice and equality. I reflect on 1969. We had a law and order president in 1969, Richard Nixon. And I won't go into any more parallels between that and the current occupant of the White House. But we had a law and order president. We also had an epidemic, if not a pandemic, of a little thing called the Hong Kong flu in 1969. And it scythed its way through the American population. I would also remind folk that 1969 was a year of great unrest. And so we have been at this junction in the road. And as that generation did, we want the current generation to understand that they must maintain the struggle, that whatever the side issues might be, and we are concerned that there could be a tremendous loss of Black life, since it's already hitting our community disproportionately, Black and brown communities disproportionately. I mean, when we talk about losses in war, we may see in the matter of a year or two losses equaling the kind of losses this nation received in modern wars. That's entirely possible. But even with that, we must maintain the fight. We must keep focused and know that there is justice down the road, and that where we are now is one more step forward on a long and winding road.
Well, thank you so much for that word. That is something definitely I hope our viewers take with them and keep with them as they think about the protest and COVID, but also think about preserving our history and the legacy of African Americans. And so I want to ask, as my sort of final closing question, is there anything that you would like to say to our viewers that we haven't covered?
I think that the appointment of General Brown as the chief of the Air Force is historically significant. It should have been done years ago. We have a military today in which we see that Black people are a significant portion, but we still see echoes of the same old patterns that we find in the non-military portion. We still have a battle for Black officers. If there is one area which we have not seen the kind of positive change that we would be happier to see, it is in the presence of Black officers. It's not that the people with the qualifications are there, but it is still difficult to rise through the ranks. So I think in closing, I would say that we need not to become so frustrated at the slowness of change in the military that we take it off our plate as an arena of opportunity, that we take courage and inspiration from our past service in the military, where Black men and women have distinguished themselves since the beginning of this country. And those are two unfailing ways that we can look with pride on our contribution to this country and the battle for a better day.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope that everyone who has watched this has enjoyed our conversation. And if you so choose, please visit asalh.org/donate and contribute to support our organization today. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks again for watching. We hope you enjoyed this broadcast. We'd like to remind you to subscribe to Asala TV, and you can also hit that notification bell to remind you of future broadcasts and episodes. We'd also like to ask you to consider making a donation to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. If this information touched you, or if you learned something today, please consider making a donation, no matter how big or small. You may make a donation by hitting the donate button in the description on the YouTube page for Asala TV. We thank you for your support, and we look forward to seeing you in a future broadcast.